you mentioned you were at a march on Saturday. I was too. But disappointingly, there were respectable numbers, not massive numbers. But I have been saying for years already, marches where you get permits and porta potties and podiums for speakers do not accomplish anything anymore.
Hi, this is Frank Schaeffer, and this is an episode, a kind of a special episode of my podcast, In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, with my friend Civia Tamarkin, who we have been trading podcasts and conversation. Civia is someone who's very involved in alerting people to the fact that the U.S. is confronting right now a group of folks in the courts and in the Republican Party who really want to roll back the Constitution in favor of some sort of biblical mandate of a return to Old Testament law. And even beyond that, even things that aren't even in the Bible. There's nothing in the Bible about abortion, for instance, per se. And yet here we are, Civia is in Texas, and we are looking at a state that has rolled back Roe v. Wade basically all by itself as the Supreme Court folded its arms and looked the other way and pretended nothing was going on. So Civia Tamarkin is a journalist and filmmaker. Since we last spoke in August, Texas and other states have directly attacked women's rights. This weekend, I was at a demonstration in New York City with many women and many men, and we were protesting what is happening in Texas and other places. Everything is back in the air again. It's almost like just pre-Roe v. Wade, but there's a difference, Civia, and that is when Roe came down and I was on the wrong side of the issue with my dad, Francis Schaeffer, and we made the film series, Whatever Happened to the Human Race, with Dr. C. Everett Koop, who became Surgeon General under Ronald Reagan, we took an anti-abortion position. And to our surprise at that time, most of the evangelical leaders we went to for support, like Reverend Billy Graham, the famous evangelist, Dr. Criswell, who was the president of the Southern Baptist Seminary in Dallas, as well as pastors of First Baptist in Dallas, as well as president of the Southern Baptist Convention. These guys were pro-choice. I just want to say that again. These evangelical leaders in the 70s were pro-choice. And now we just assume that every evangelical is anti-abortion and a misogynist. But people like Billy Graham, for instance, said, how can I tell women not to have abortions when, I'm here to share the love of Jesus with people, and that's not even in the Bible. And Fran, as he called my dad, Francis Schaeffer, I just can't get involved in this one. I'm sorry, I got burned when I took too political a stand with Richard Nixon. I'm never going to do that again. I don't think a lot of folks know the fact that when Roe v. Wade came down, a lot of evangelicals were in support of abortion rights. Do you think they know that, Civia?
I do not think most people are aware of that. I don't think that most people are aware, as you had mentioned, that the Republican Party platform pre-Roe endorsed bodily autonomy, endorsed a woman's right to make her own medical decisions. And it was only after Roe passed when the Catholic Church became adamant that this needed to be overturned, and the evangelical movement in the late 70s began to emerge, critical of Jimmy Carter, I might add, who was obviously Southern Baptist, but supported the right to make one's own medical decisions. In reaction to him, there was this huge backlash, and that's how it began to emerge, thanks to your father. The whole moral majority movement as it emerged. What is interesting is that what we are seeing now is beyond anyone's comprehension. But we are seeing the results, must give credit where it's due, of the most extraordinary propaganda campaign that we have ever seen in this country, in the free world. I mean, it is redolent of the controlled propaganda campaigns. It's 1984 speak, Orwellian in nature. And I mean, I'm in Arizona, and we just won an injunction against a ban on terminating pregnancies for fetuses with genetic anomalies. And you hear the opposition say, we will defend the rights of preborn children. Who ever heard of the term preborn children? I mean, we're talking fertilized eggs, zygotes, embryos, pre-viable fetuses. And suddenly, the part of this Arizona law, for example, that was not enjoined was a personhood interpretation that gives the fetus at every stage of development rights and protections under all Arizona statutes. So while we were pleased that we won an injunction against the so-called reason ban, the reason based on genetic anomalies, we are very concerned about the latitude that something like the personhood interpretation can have. I understand the judge did not enjoin it because there was no imminent threat. But as people begin to interpret how it applies to every statute, I mean, you know, what becomes if a pregnant person is carrying something too heavy and miscarries? Is that involuntary manslaughter? Is that child endangerment? Where does one begin to interpret? So they have gone far beyond what they say is a respect for life. First of all, there is nothing more respectful of life than caring about the life of a person who has the capacity for pregnancy. But we are now living in an absolute dark age. And, you know, you mentioned you were at a march on Saturday. I was too. But disappointingly, there were respectable numbers, not massive numbers. But I have been saying for years already, marches where you get permits and porta potties and platforms for podiums for speakers do not accomplish anything anymore. We have to get out voters. We have to vote. We have to encourage other people to vote. And we have to make sure that the right people who respect bodily autonomy are in, you know, legislative positions. And that's
that includes in state governments as well. You know, it seems to me when you look at what's happened to Roe v. Wade and this attack, this direct attack on women, which by many politicians who are going along with it is designed only for one purpose. And it's the same reason that they still deny that Biden won the election. They know he won, but they are catering to a white nationalist evangelical voter who is still backing Trump. They are catering to that vote, knowing full well that it is lie-based, and they're doing it with vaccine rejection as well.
Correct.
So you have three things going on here that are all very related because they all relate to catering to a certain group in the electorate who are a minority in terms of numbers, but control the Republican Party, and that is white evangelical right-wing Trump supporters. In catering to them, the Republican Party is still on the wrong side of climate change. They deny it. They're still on the side of the oil and coal industries because evangelical Christians deny climate change for weird eschatological reasons where they say Jesus is coming back, so it doesn't matter anymore. Go figure. That same group is now the heart of the vaccine rejection movement and the misinformation in the same way they were with QAnon. So there's another anti-science platform. And then the propaganda and the lies surrounding the abortion debate, which now are just unveiled as naked misogyny. It's not even about abortion anymore. From my point of view, it's about curbing women's rights per se, putting them back in the box where, quote, they belong. And if you think of any kind of comparable legislative efforts or court efforts to curb the rights of males on any comparable level, whether it's child custody battles or the right not to have vasectomies or parental rights of some other sort, you can't imagine the courts going along with this. In other words, it just seems to me we've gone past even pretending this is about abortion. This is a naked attack on women by a group of evangelicals who, by the way, believe that patriarchy is biblical, that men should be in charge. So the whole thing here, the thrust from my background as a former evangelical, is as it were to put women back in the box where they belong. And really the fact that it's not called out as such is really horrible. And we have to stop pretending this is about abortion. This is about women, and this is about putting women back in a pre-Roe, pre-60s, pre-feminist box. That's it.
Well,
they don't like women, and men have bought into this, and too many evangelical women have bought into the idea that they're supposed to be subservient to males. It's part of that, as far as I can see it.
well, it is definitely all about gender inequality. It is about subservience. It goes back to the original premises, even in the founding of this country. I mean, women didn't have rights. It was all men are created equal, which of course we know was a misnomer anyway. But women were possessions. Women belonged to their fathers and they belonged to their husbands. It was the fathers who could marry them off. I recently had a discussion with a young woman who's about to get married and is changing her name to her husband-to-be's. And I said, why? In this day and age, you are not a possession. You do not belong to him. Mm-hmm. But there is still a vestige of that mentality. But this is definitely all about gender inequality. And it is reflective. People keep talking about, first of all, we have to change the verbiage. It is not choice. Yeah. Choice was at the time, in the 60s and 70s, we thought there was something resonant about my body, my choice. Yeah. When you have no options, you have no choices. That's right. And there are no options out there. There have not been options out there for poor women, for women of color, since the Hyde Amendment took effect in 1976. Yeah. So if you do not have the financial resources, you do not have the access, then you have no choice. But it goes beyond that. We need to stop talking about this as a women's rights only. It's not just the right to bodily autonomy and medical decisions and access to health care. It's economic parity. And if people would step back, and look at what it costs this country, it has cost annually, it costs the U.S. $105 billion in lost revenue, wages, limited company growth, lost sales, wages, etc., because of reproductive restrictions. In the state of Texas, it's costing upwards of $14 billion. In Arizona, where we've been fighting, upwards of $2.7 billion. This is an economic issue. And instead of women being outraged, everyone needs to be outraged, and corporations. And now there's an attempt to make corporations realize the high cost of this. In Texas, Cecile Richards has called American Bridge PAC, where they are starting to expose the hypocrisy of corporations. I'll go on record and say AT&T, for example, which claims that its core value is promoting the rights of women, gave $700,000 to Texas legislators who supported this bill. Yeah. So we need to begin looking at. Be called on it. Yeah, it's good. Absolutely. These people need to be named and called. I want to go back to a point you were making before, because about not having real choices. And I don't just think it applies to women of color or people who don't have the finances. I think it is women, but also men in general. And I'll tell you what I mean. The choice is have an abortion or have a baby and go broke and change your entire life, because the entire corporate system is geared against families. We talk about being pro-family and all these other things. I think America is essentially anti-family. And the funny thing is, the same thing that makes it anti-family and anti-child, and I'll explain in a minute, is also what makes it anti-abortion. And that is, it's trying to limit the choices people have. So a woman who, for instance, is not poor, but has a high-flying, high-paying career, is basically forced by her company, social pressure more than just laws. First of all, there's no policy for childcare. Secondly, there's no policy for being able to take time off from work and come back without a loss of status. And that applies equally to men. I was doing an event in New York this weekend,
about my new book, Fall in Love, Have Children, Stay Put, Save the Planet, Be Happy, that's coming out November 2nd. Little plug for the book there. But one of the chapters in the book is about how men face the pressure to also deny their families, in that they suffer a loss of prestige if they take time, for instance, and say to their wife, hey, you go work, I'm going to help you. We have enough income. I'll stay home for a year or two and help with the kids. First of all, I enjoy being with my children. Secondly, I want your career to succeed. We don't even have a social kind of acceptance of equal male, female, non-binary, gay, straight roles where we can swap off and help each other. And then when you get to financing actual childcare, no one has stepped up. When you get to preschool age children, depending on what state you're in, there's very little for anybody. So even at the stage where women have a career, the whole culture is geared against them being able to also comfortably have a child if they want one, and or choose to have an abortion. They're not given a choice to have a child either. They're told, put your career first. You need this big, sexy career. We're going to define you by your job title. And if you do have a kid, by the way, lie about it. Don't say, hey, I'm doing a school pickup. Say you're on the way to a busy meeting, because no one's going to forgive you for having a family in this pro-family thing. So these same evangelicals that always are whining about pro-family and tradition and all the rest of it do nothing to support family or tradition as they would see it, and then try to also prevent women from having choice and autonomy over their own bodies. So this is really burning the candle at both ends, and it's totally unfair, but it's also unfair to men, because our culture is anti-child, anti-abortion and anti-child coexisting in this weird relationship of simply trying to pretend the only thing that matters is your career, make money for the corporations. We don't care about the rest. We're not going to help you. And by the way, there's no government funding for your childcare anyway. So you're on your own. That's not a choice.
Well, we're seeing the hypocrisy play out everywhere. We're seeing it in state legislatures. You know, I'd like to call attention to the fact that the Arizona legislature, the same lawmakers that wanted to protect fetuses with disabilities, vetoed a bill that would subsidize health care for people with spina bifida, born with spina bifida.
There, you've just put it together. You got to repeat that, because there's the deal. Everything we've just said here in terms of our fake family values and the hypocrisy of the evangelical, quote unquote, pro-life movement, you just put it there. That's it. So repeat that example. The same legislature that did this. Say it again.
The same legislature in Arizona that passed a ban on abortions due to genetic anomalies of a fetus, because they claimed they wanted to protect fetuses with disabilities. That's their quote. Vetoed a bill that would have provided state subsidized health care for people born with spina bifida for their extended lifetime.
That's it.
They also vetoed a bill. Well, here's another one. They also care so much about the fetus, they vetoed a bill that would have provided dental care for women, pregnant people who could not afford it. Yeah. And one knows that that could very well affect the well-being of the fetus. So it's all hypocritical. And then, of course, we all know the moment that the fetus is born, nobody wants to fund education. No one wants to fund daycare. No one wants to fund family leave. I mean, this is what we're facing in Congress now.
And then anytime someone like Joe Biden comes along and wants to help people, the Republicans want to means test everything and make this woman with this child that they forced to keep the child prove that she'd really rather be out there somehow having a career while they provided no child care for her to do so. And she's not going to get any help. So, you know, on top of everything else, there's a kind of an anti-poor people campaign in the Republican Party that criminalizes poverty to the point where poor people are asked to jump through hoops that no corporation ever is when it comes to corporate welfare. No billionaire is when they're allowed to move money offshore. The whole system is iniquitous. But I just want to say again, at the bottom of the pile here, The same evangelical culture that is anti-woman and anti-choice is also, and this is where we really can't let them off the hook, fundamentally anti-family and anti-child. They are not about helping families.
Even in their opposition to any kind of environmental justice, to any kind of climate change controls. I mean, we only have to look at Flint, Michigan to see all the children that were getting sick from the water.
Yep.
We see higher incidences of asthma and bronchial conditions among children than ever before. Obviously, we're dealing with pollution, but we see it also in their ban on mask mandates in schools in Florida and other states. If you don't want to protect children outside of the womb, then how dare you be so vocal about protecting a fertilized egg?
Yeah, and where are those movements of anti-vaccine misinformation, right-wing propaganda, anti-woman activism in taking choice away, and not just choice on abortion, even contraceptive coverage from insurance companies? Right. You look across the board, I'm just going to say it again, and I know I sound like a broken record, but it bears worth repeat. It's worth repeating. The evangelicals have moved from a pro-choice position with their leadership in the 1970s to not just being anti-choice, but becoming the kind of poster child for everything that is anti-science and pro-mythology across the board. So Jesus is coming back, so it doesn't matter if the climate is ruined, and our children are going to pay. I mean, this is unbelievable when you think about it, and you see these right-wing preachers on Facebook and these other places telling people that essentially they need to trust God rather than getting a vaccine. You see parents, evangelical white voter parents, verbally attacking and chasing school board members down the street who had the temerity to try to protect their children with school masks. So it's like a river jumping the banks, the Mississippi jumping the banks in a flood. It's not just the choice issue. It is everything to do with science and rationality is now just down the toilet.
It's so anti-family. This is not just anti-woman. It's anti-public, it's anti-public health. Yeah. It is a disregard for humanity is what we're talking about here. Yeah. And it is a suppression of women, certainly, but more so of the entire, human decency and protection of citizens. Basically, all these legislators on every level have abrogated their responsibility for public safety and well-being, whether it is banning educational material in schools, whether it is muzzling teachers, prohibiting masks, being anti-vax, being against any kind of modification of, the destruction of carbon, et cetera, that is ruining the environment. They don't care. They have their one agenda, and it's irrational, but it's obsessive.
Well, and it's treasonous towards the interest of their own children. I mean, these people have kids and grandchildren, and they're basically washing their hands of it and saying, we're not going to help you. The ruined future is yours. We're going to profit now, and we're going to do what we do now, but we don't care about your future. And I can't imagine, as a father and a grandfather, I can't imagine a message that is less moral to the next generation. I just want to remind people you're watching In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer or listening to it as a podcast. I'm with Civia Tamarkin, who's an activist and very, very wonderful voice when it comes to not just women's issues, but I want to go further and just say human rights. And so, Civia, let me ask you, as someone on the front lines who's been there for so long, where do people need to put their efforts in this fight now in terms of just trying to salvage some sort of dignity for women in this country, after this assault by the Trump voter, white nationalist evangelical right? And it's just gaining strength. And now they have allies on the Supreme Court. They have a majority on the Supreme Court. What can people do?
Well, you have to mobilize, and it's all going to I don't mean, as I said earlier, marches and protests per se that are well organized. You have to mobilize. This is all going back to states' rights. There is very little doubt that if the Supreme Court does not overturn Roe, it will be whittled away to such an extent as it is now, that it is not available for women and people with capacity for pregnancy. We can't forget transgender as well.
Sure.
Across 90% of the counties in this country. And what they are also doing, let's remember that they are shifting the line here. So, let's go away from the old language of choice and let's move away from the old visuals of coat hangers. It's not coat hangers. What they're doing is they are banning in many states medicated abortions.
Yeah.
You will get that. You get, the pills through the mail, whatever. It's illegal in many states. It must be administered by a provider in many states. And therefore, we're looking at criminal penalties. So what we have to do is operate on a local level. We have to change the state legislatures, and we have to get out the vote. We also, let's just remember that there have been a record 106 restrictions passed this year alone on access to reproductive health care. Since 1973, Roe v. Wade, over 1,300 restrictions passed. So Roe is very much, whittled away, eviscerated, non-existent for most of this country. We have to concentrate on state legislatures. We have to get out the vote. We cannot be inhibited by all of the attempts to restrict voter rights. We have to stand up for voter rights. We have to get out the vote. But the other thing is that we have to exercise pocketbook pressure. Every time I see a woman walking into Hobby Lobby, who was the Hobby Lobby decision back in 2014, which allowed corporations to eliminate contraceptive coverage in their corporate insurance. Every time I see someone walk in there and I say, why are you shopping here? Well, my kid has an art project. I said, there are other places. Yeah. We have to begin to identify the companies that are restricting access to healthcare, because reproductive healthcare is healthcare. It is public
or the
healthcare.
Companies like you suggested about AT&T, who are donating to far right-wing ideological anti-woman, anti-choice legislators on the state and national level. These companies have to be held to account. If you give somebody money who is trying to demolish women's rights in this country, that has to be made public.
These companies are complicit, and anyone who patronizes these companies is an enabler. And so, you have to you can't stand up and just shout about rights. One needs to be able to demonstrate that kind of commitment. This is, it's very interesting to go back to the Texas Senate Bill 8. That is a form of the Fugitive Slave Law all over again. The vigilante bounty hunters. So if one connects the dots backward, you begin to see that this is all about servitude, subservience, the enslavement, and the possession of people who have a capacity for pregnancy. So we need to undo that. What ultimately broke slavery, the Civil War, but it was their defense of slavery was that it was the economy, that it supported the Confederacy economy. We need to break the economic hold on, the denial of bodily autonomy, reproductive health care. We need to speak up and again, boycott, put our dollars toward companies that support. You look at companies, and I think they deserve a plug. Uber and Lyft agreed to supply legal defense for any of their drivers who might be charged under the Senate Bill 8 for driving somebody to obtain an abortion.
Yeah.
And therefore, they are standing up. There are
Yeah.
other companies as well, Ben and Jerry's, a number of them. But we need to begin to follow these companies because the ones that support the lawmakers are absolutely fueling the pipeline.
Yeah.
Of
And,
this kind of
we have
servitude.
someone that we both know, Jose Zylstra has a nonprofit called Gender Fair that rates companies just based on how they treat women. And I think, I haven't talked to Jose about this. Actually, I'm going to see her next week. She's doing an event for my book in her backyard, the release of this new book of mine coming out November 2nd. And I'm going to ask Jose if there's a way for her to organize her algorithm to begin to look at the way companies donate to anti-woman candidates as part of her evaluation. In other words, not just how they are treating women with respect or disrespect, equality, and so forth within the corporation, but how are they positioning themselves in the broader fight? Where do they politically donate? So anyway, Civia, I want to thank you and wrap this up at this point and look forward to more conversations with you. All the links to what you do and how people get in touch with you will be on our sites wherever we put this. I would encourage anyone who wants to be active in this fight to get in touch with Civia. She's a real leader with tremendous wisdom and breadth of experience in this. I wish that it wasn't so, Civia. I wish this was all behind us.
I do too.
I mean, I'm reliving the fact that I was on the wrong side of the fight in the 70s. I thought this would sort of go away, that we had been proved wrong, that I wrote my memoir and came out the other side. And instead of that, sadly, as I get older, I'm still mired in this. And in my case, unlike you, it's partly the fault of my own family and my activity. But thanks.
Well, mine isn't, but I will say that, like you, I can't believe that we are still fighting this fight. I was out there as a young person in the 60s, and here I am doing this all over as a grandmother.
Yeah.
And, it's like, where was the progress? We thought we won the battle.
Yeah.
And we became complacent and allowed the opposition to strategize.
Well, and they played a very clever long game. If you look at things like the Federalist Society grooming people like Amy Coney Barrett, funded with Koch money and other things like this, the Koch brothers money and other people like that, they played a long game and they've been very successful. They started with these guys when they were kids in law school.
Right.
And they followed it up and now they're judges. And that was the list that Ralph Reed and the other right-wing activists gave Trump. They said, we don't care about your adultery and your fondling women and probably all the women who have had abortions that you've had sex with over the years. But what we do care about is here's our list of judges. So the right played the kind of consistent long game that you're telling us we, need to be serious about.
Right. We thought we won at the Supreme Court, the highest court in the land, and we just assumed there's no going back. And it was a mistake. And the movement became fractionalized. Younger generations became complacent and felt entitled. They felt they had these rights, that they would never be threatened. So now we're back at it. But I must say, so dire at this point because there is so much at stake.
Yeah, I'm reminded a little bit when you say everybody thought, well, these are our rights, and we kind of had them, of what happened when the Vietnam War ended, and all of a sudden all the student protests about American foreign intervention in wars that were not where we should be went away. And, now we've just done a 20-year war in Afghanistan and lost that war. My son, as a Marine, was in the beginning of that war and fought that war and came back and said, hey, Dad, this war is lost. And that was before anybody else saw that. And the men on the ground knew, and the women on the ground knew. But, it's always this same cycle, isn't it? And that is, you can't take anything for granted. So, So, the Vietnam generation suddenly lost an interest in the military industrial complex. And here we are, two or three failed wars later, back where we were at the end of Vietnam. And now it comes to women's rights and the rights of transgender people and others. And this battle looks like it's all starting again. So we can't fall asleep at the switch, I think, is your message.
We can't do that. And what we have to realize is the agenda is using religion as a political tool.
Yeah.
That is what is so terrifying. I mean, the owners of Hobby Lobby recently took out a full-page ad saying that we should have religion as part of the government.
Mhm.
So the very founding premise of separation of church and state is what many of these evangelicals now believe should be eroded.
Well,
That
and
there should be
democracy
no
itself.
barrier.
That if you
Exactly.
lose an election, you challenge it and you say you won.
Exactly.
So
So
it's not
it is,
just a-
it is the big lie. It is the big lie that we all read about as kids. You know, it's the Orwellian, it's the propaganda, and now we are living it. And the very democracy that we are living in is so threatened and eroding.
Yeah.
And we need to stand up and we need to do something, and we need to do it through our vote.
Yeah. And it's part of a global phenomena where you have all sorts of fundamentalist theocratic religion, whether it's the Wahhabi Saudi royal family, whether it's the Hindu nationalists with Modi in India, you know, some of the more fanatical West Bank settlers in Israel who have turned this into sort of a war of religion there. Touch it where you want. It isn't just the states. You know, anybody who in the 20th century thought that we were on the way to sort of a rational enlightenment secularism was misled. You know, we are now in a global conflict between people who believe in democracy and various forms of religion imposing a kind of form of theocracy on our countries. And it isn't just the states, but how amazing that this home of democracy here that everybody took for granted. Well, in America, of course, elections will always be this way and they'll be fair. No, we can't take this for granted here anymore either.
No, and there have to be consequences once and for all these lawmakers who know better and are still denying the results of a fair election and an election that the courts continuously, I mean, again, I'm based in Arizona. We had the cyber ninjas. The cyber ninjas, for all of the commotion and controversy and cost around fraudit, as it's been called, did say the elections were fair, the elections were valid, and yet Donald Trump, a day later, was at a rally in, I believe, Georgia, saying, or South Carolina, saying, no, the cyber ninjas upheld the fact that he won. This is delusional. This is delusional, you know, and so we have to really stand up now and hold those legislators, Congress people who support the big lie accountable.
Yeah, absolutely. And the companies that fund them. Civia, can we have you back soon again so we can keep track of all this? Because I think that, you know, you're such a leader in this fight and you can keep us current on what's going on. If we can keep inviting you back to talk about it, I'd be very grateful. Okay, well, listen.
Let's hope that we don't have to. Let's hope that we make progress.
I think we, you know, the next election's important. Let's hope the Democrats get up there and do some legislating so Biden has a track record to run on instead of quibbling amongst themselves too much. So Civia, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, Frank Schaeffer in conversation with Civia Tamarkin today. And I thank you, Civia, for taking the time. We will have you back as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.